Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Kiddushin Daf Pei. This month's learning is sponsored by Esther Kremer in loving memory of her father, Manny Gross, Zichrono Livracha, on his first year at site. Today's stuff is sponsored by Diana Bloom in loving memory of her Zaidi, Israel Marmarek. The memory of his commitment to the state of Israel and the Jewish community of Buenos Aires continues to serve as an inspiration. And today's stuff is unfortunately sponsored in memory of the soldiers killed in yesterday's battle, among them Sergeant Rowie Wolf, Sergeant Levi Lifshitz, and a close friend of my son, Lieutenant Ariel Reich. Okay, but we learn, and that's what we do every day, and it keeps us focused and doing something that's important as well. And hopefully we spend our days doing other important things, in an effort to improve our situation. Okay, we're going to get started with the bottom of yesterday's daf. So as a quick review of the Mishna, we have a man who goes abroad with his wife or without his wife, and we had different situations. He comes back with children, perhaps also comes back with his wife, perhaps comes back only with children. The question is, what is upon him to prove? Does he have to prove? And this, we're going to get into a whole thing today about when somebody looks like they have a family, right? They seem to be living together as a family. Can we assume that they're all really a family? This has all sorts of ramifications. We're going to get into them right at the beginning of today's stuff. So the first thing we saw was that we can assume the children follow the mother in particular situations in the Mishnah. And whenever we assume that, Rabbi Barafuna says, we'll go back to the beginning of the Gemara, Bikulam bikruchim achareha. This is if they look like she's their mother. They treat them as her mother. Then we can assume that she's really the mother. Okay, this is the classic that, and the Gemara is going to say, we already saw this in the Braita, that it's going to be a difference between younger children and older children, because older children can, lie and make up things. But we all know that little kids, and today we're going to have a few different things that are interesting about little kids. But one thing we know about little kids is they're always honest. They don't usually, at least about things like that, it's very clear if you're the mother, right? I always think about like in passport control or something, when they're not sure, like you can see, they can figure out whether you're really going together as you're the mother or, okay. Now, I'm a Rabbi Barafuna, so that's what he says. Now we have a Braita, Tanu Rabbanan. We're going to start from there again. Ishana Sati b'Medinat Hayam. This was like our Mishnah. He comes back and he says, listen, I got married abroad. Mevi raya la isha ve'ein sarich lavi raya la banim. He just has to prove that his wife had good lineage, and then we can assume the children also. But then we said, he does, when we say he doesn't need to bring a proof for the sons, that's only the ones that are going with the mother. But if they're not, if they're older, then we need a proof, because it could be they were born from some other woman. This is only when he only has one wife. But if there's two wives, then we can't be sure just because the children follow one mother that she's the real mother. Now, there's a whole debate about why this is, number one. And number two, what scenario we're talking about. Are we talking about a scenario where he comes back with one of the two wives and one of them is dead? And then, right, the one who he claimed, if, let's say, he had two wives abroad and now he comes back with only one and the children are following the one who's there. So then, according to this, they'd be saying, well, that doesn't prove anything, because it could be she's just taking care of them because the other mother's no longer there and they treat her like the mother, just like an adopted mother would be treated like the kid's mother, and it would be the same thing. Some people say, and this is even more interesting, and this is a little hard for us to understand because we don't have situations where there's two wives married to one man, but perhaps when there's two wives married to one man, the children of one wife might prefer the other wife to the other mother to be their mother. Now, some people actually claim, which is kind of funny, because their own mother will be a big disciplinarian and the other mother might be a lot nicer to them. So, it could be that they'll end up having more of an attachment to the other mother, and then that won't prove anything. So there's an interesting big debate here between the commentaries. Rashi says it's that the wife died, and that's why they're following the other mother. The Rambam has it as no. It's really a case that both are alive, but it doesn't matter. It could be that they're following the other mother anyway, and then kruchim won't really help us. And now we're going to have a machloket Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan about this issue of kruchim. Kruchim is really another way of saying there's a chazaka. There's a presumed status, right? That's what chazaka means. We have a presumed status of something. So if the children follow the mother and act like they're the mother, and everyone thinks they're the mother, and nobody seems to be claiming, and no other woman comes along and says, hey, those are my children, so we can assume that that's the mother. And Reish Lakish says, well, lo shanu ela kodshei hagvul. This is only true. Okay, now kodshei hagvul is a non-clear term, what we're talking about here, for sanctified items, maybe in Jerusalem, unclear exactly, but not for yuchsin. So Rashi and Rabbanit have a big debate here what this is referring to. Rashi seems to be saying that kodshei hagvul means we can assume, let's say, the father's a Kohen, the mother is married to him, and the mother we know to be a kosher, right? She's not a halala, for example. So, or any woman who can't marry a Kohen. So that means the son is allowed to eat truma based on the fact that we assume, right, that this child is the mother's child. Okay, we don't have proof of it. Again, this is a case not like we saw the mother give birth to this child. We're talking about the mother comes from abroad, married to the guy. We don't, and the kid's already been born. We have no idea. Maybe they picked up a kid along the way. Maybe they found an asufi on the street, right? So we can assume this child can eat truma based on the fact that they're living together, but not for yuchsin. Now, what does it mean for yuchsin? So until now, yuchsin always means for marriage purposes. Maybe, maybe we'll have to worry that this, if it's a daughter, let's say that she's a halala and she can't marry Kohen. Okay, that's what Rashi seems to distinguish between marriage-related issues and truma issues. Tosfos says this doesn't make any sense because you don't need kruchim for truma. If the father says this is my son, then we allow the kid to eat truma. So that can't be what the Gemara is talking about. And Rabbi Yochanan says that what it's talking about is that bechol, I'm reading like about 10 lines from the bottom of the first Tosfot, bechol davar kedusha kegon letruma ulenesiut kapayim ulasi elisha. All the issues Rashi said, Reish Lakish thinks is fine. Truma, duchening, berkat kohanim, and marriage purposes. We can marry, okay? We can assume his yichud is good. If it's a girl, we can assume she can marry a kohen. So what's liyuchsin? Liyuchsin is something else. And the strength of Rabbeinu Tam is going to be that you're going to see this come up later in the sugya today, which is Klomar liskol al yado dekamar ze beno v'zo imo v'haben ba'aleha lo mehema. In other words, when Reish Lakish says we don't believe them for yuchsin, let's say, okay, they show up as a family with kids, and years later the mother ends up having a sexual relationship with the son. Normally they would get stoned, but we're not going to stone you based on chazaka. Okay, that's what Reish Lakish is saying. Rabbi Yochanan amar afilu b'yuchsin. Rabbi Yochanan says no, even yuchsin. Again, either like Rashi, even for yuchsin we can rely on it and let these people marry, right? Maybe it's marriage related, like they're not a halal or something like that. According to Tosfot, we even allow that you can get skila. Okay, you can get stoned based on this relationship, which is actually very interesting to say because normally when we give the death penalty, we have to be extra certain that he was warned, there were witnesses, everything has to line up properly. And in this case, even without witnesses, now, again, there were witnesses to the fact that they have relations, but we don't even know that they're related and actually are deserving of skila for this, of stoning. But we actually allow it, that's how strong chazak is, according to Rabbi Yochanan, according to this interpretation. Now, even if you don't go by this interpretation, you're going to see that later Rabbi Yochanan says this exactly. So it's clear he holds this. Just a matter of what yuchsin can include, according to, right, Rashi might say even more things. Anyway, as to Rabbi Yochanan l'tamei. So now they're going to say Rabbi Yochanan is consistent with his opinion somewhere else. So again, let's just review. Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Whether presumptive status, we assume you're living as a family, you claim that you're the parents, does that allow, is it just for issues of truma or maybe kahuna related issues, but not for getting stoned or maybe not for getting married, right? Assuming your yichud is good for marriage. And Rabbi Yochanan says it's good for everything. And now we're going to see, as to Rabbi Yochanan l'tamei, he's consistent within his approach. Okay, here Rabbi Yochanan is quoted as saying the following thing, and we're going to only understand this as we go on. The Gemara is going to give examples of each case. Malkin ala chazakot, based on chazaka, you can get lashes. Soklim v'sorfin ala chazakot, you can get stoned and burned based on chazaka. Ve'ein sorfin truma ala chazakot. Okay, don't confuse the burning and the burning. These are two totally different burnings. The burning of one is a mitat beitin. That was the first one. This is when truma, and this is going to be an important thing for you to understand for today's daf. In general, we're going to go into a bunch of cases. When truma gets contaminated, okay, which means impure, you have to burn it. However, if there's a doubt about whether it's impure or not, so the Kohen can't eat it, but he also can't burn it because truma is sanctified. So that means if something goes wrong with it and it becomes impure, it has to be burned. That's the only thing you could do with it. But if it's a suffix and you're not sure, you actually can't burn it because you can't destroy something that's good. And since it's, 50-50 or whatever the percentage is, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. So you actually can't burn it, but you also can't eat it. So he says, the one thing chazaka doesn't allow us to do is to burn truma. So now we're going to see that statement's not 100% the case. Sometimes it will, but we'll get to that later. Now we want to understand the three categories. Malkin ala chazakot, ki Rabbi Yehuda. So when he says you get lashes on chazaka, where do we see that? Well, we see Rabbi Yehuda says this, and that must be what Rabbi Yochanan meant. To Amar Rabbi Yehuda, huchzika nida b'shchenoteha, ba'ala lokeh aleh mishum nida. We have a situation where somehow people witnessed a woman having relations with her husband. I don't know how exactly somebody witnessed this, but it was known to the neighbors. This is interesting. Okay, in general, those days, women generally did know when people were in nida, and her neighbors knew she was in nida at the time. She was having her period. So basically, they can be, it's forbidden for, you get actually karet, a man who has relations with his wife when she's menstruating, when she's technically in nida, then he gets lashes. Now, he gets karet. Okay, they both get karet, but you can actually give lashes in the court when there's karet and there's no death penalty, then the penalty is lashes. Okay, the court can give you lashes. So if the neighbors said, we know she has her period, and it's not like witness, right? They didn't see, but they just know because, maybe showed them or all that, we don't know. But that's enough to give them lashes. Okay, they actually both get lashes. So klim v'tzorfin alachat. So that's a chazaka. Her presumed status is she's in nida because her friends think so. And that's enough to say you can get lashes. Very interesting. So clean v'tzorfin alachazakot. So what does that mean? Kidiramba baravhum. Okay, this was stated by somebody else. So we have a situation, there's a man, a woman, a son, and a daughter. And they've been living in the same house together as if they're a family. Okay, we don't know that they're a family, but we assume. Niskalim ze'alzeh v'nisrafin ze'alzeh. Okay, if a man sleeps with his daughter, the punishment is burning. If a woman sleeps with her son, the punishment is stoning. So basically, if the man slept with the daughter or the mother slept with the son, we can administer the punishment of skila or streifa accordingly based on the fact that they've been living in this house together. And that's what we explained before. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says. That again matches what he said before, which is if this, right, we can go by kruchim, right, what the kids treat them like the mother, right? We can assume that you can even for yuchsin, and this, by the way, like I said, this supports what Rabbeinu Tam explained, that yuchsin means just to know who's related to who in terms of divvying out punishments. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Mishum bar kapara, and in fact, he says there was a case that actually happened. A woman showed up in Jerusalem with a baby on her shoulders, v'higdilato, and she brought him up. And later on, she had relations with him, and they actually stoned them based on this presumed status that she treated the baby as if it was her own. And then when later he got older and they had relations, they stoned them. Not because we know for sure that it was her son, but because the child called her the mother. And there you have a proof. Okay. The one thing we didn't do yet, which is going to be the more complicated one, which is what is ein sorfin truma lachazakot? We have a kind of funny situation. I think we'll laugh with this. So now you can't burn truma based on chazaka. So what's the story? The Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, sorfim lachazakot, Rabbi Yochanan Amar ein sorfim. So first, we're just going to know that there's a machlok. Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, that's Reish Lakish, says you actually can burn based on chazaka. He thinks chazaka is strong enough to burn truma, and Rabbi Yochanan thinks it's not. What's the case? Va'az du l'tamayu. Well, they're consistent within their approach, as we see here. Ditnan. Tinok shenimtza b'tzad isa. We have a picture here. We're in the kitchen. We have a big batch of dough, and we have a little kid sitting next to the dough with a little piece of dough in his hand. Okay, classic situation. Okay, so tinok nimtza b'tzad isa. The tinok is right next to the dough and has batzeik in his hand. Now, Rabbi Meir mitaher. The question is this. Well, the question is, what's the question? Okay, big machloket Rashi again in Rabbeinu Tam. So let's go with the sugya according to Rashi, and then I'll teach it according to Rabbeinu Tam. So first we'll go with Rashi. Rashi says, well, let's read it inside for a minute, but Rabbi Meir says, we're going to say the entire dough is totally fine. The Chachamim say this is no good, and I'm now explaining according to Rashi what this line means, because children generally touch things, which means what? Okay, so this can mean one of two things. According to Rashi, the concern is that children's hands carry impurity, because what do? They go through garbage, they touch bugs and dead creatures, and they touch lots of things, and their hands are generally impure. Now, what's obvious according to this? It's obvious that the dough, right? You don't need a genius to figure this out, that the kid pulled a piece of the dough, right? It reminds me, my mother was just telling the story. I don't know why she was telling it. I can't remember, but of years ago when my older brother was a little kid and they went to this engagement party for someone. And my mother thinks that the woman's still angry with her, the woman of the house, because my brother walks into the house. It was this beautiful cake and sticks his hand right into the cake and destroyed the cake. So basically, right, that's what you assume. You assume the kid stuck his hand into the dough. Why else does he have dough in his hand? It's obvious. You don't need a genius to figure that out. What's the safek? The safek is it tamei or not? Okay. Were his hands impure? If his hands carried impurity, then he definitely, right, and he definitely touched the dough, well, then the dough would be impure. But if his hands didn't carry impurity, then no. Okay. So the truth is, I'll tell you Rabbeinu Tam right now. I won't wait till the end of the sugya. Rabbeinu Tam says, wait a minute. No, we don't know that the kid touched the dough. There's a good chance. Again, it's all going to be a matter of percentages, right? High percentage, according to Rashi, we're going to see this inside in a minute, that the kid's hands were impure, right? That's the high percentage. But there is a small chance that not. According to Rabbeinu Tam, we assume the kid's hands are definitely tamei. The question is, did the kid touch the dough or not? Did the kid get the dough in his hand by himself, or did somebody give it to him? Maybe somebody was there and gave the kid a little piece of the dough. Okay. So now, now they say the following. So let's read it inside. And by the way, what Rabbeinu Tam says against Rashi, although there is a problem with Rabbeinu Tam later in the sugya, that's why there's always two opinions, but none is perfect. He says, why would it say tinok shenimtza b'tzad ha'isah u'batzek biyado? Why would it be he's next to the, if he's next to the Isa, right? According to Rashi, if it's definite that he touched the dough, and it's just a question whether his hands were impure, then it shouldn't have said the kid's next to the dough and he has a piece of dough in his hand. It would have said the kid touched the dough, because it doesn't matter if he was next to it, right? Next to it makes it sound like we're not 100% sure that he actually took it himself. Okay, that's what he claims. The language doesn't match. According to Rashi, the case should have been much simpler. The kid touched the dough. Is it impure or is it not? Can we assume the kid's hands are impure or not? Anyway, it's an interesting machloket between them. There are all sorts of ramifications, but we don't really have time to go into all this in today's stuff. So I'll give you the highlights. So now let's go back to the case. So we have this kid, we have the dough. We're not sure either whether his hands are impure, or we don't know whether he took it from it and actually touched the big dough. So Rabbi Meir says the whole big dough is pure. We don't know yet why. We're going to see this in a minute. And Chachamim, I'm just going back. We're going to treat this as impure because we assume the kid touched, again, either touched other things and then did this, or touched the dough himself. And that's the question. Now they ask the following question. My time at Rabbi Meir. Why does Rabbi Meir say it's tahor? Right? Chances are the kid was impure and touched it, or chances are kid, right? Either which one, right? But chances are. So now they say the following. Well, the majority of kids do touch things, but the minority don't. But on the other hand, we have something pulling on the other side. So while it's true that the majority of kids touch the dough, but until we know otherwise, the dough has presumed status of purity. The dough is pure until we know otherwise. So we take the minority of people, right? That the minority of kids that don't touch, and then we connect that to the fact that this dough had a presumed status of purity, and that weakens the rove of that most kids touch things, okay? And therefore, Rabbi Meir says we can rule that it's tahor based on that. Rabbanan say, what are you talking about? The minority of kids who don't touch is as if it's nothing. It's as if we erase it entirely because we have rove and we follow the majority. So the minority just disappears entirely. And then what do we have? We have ruba on one side, we have rove. Most kids touch things. We have, on the other hand, chazaka, which is, there was a presumed status of purity. Well, when you have ruba but chazaka, ruba adif. Okay, this is classic rules. When you have a majority that goes against a chazaka, presumed status, the majority is going to win. So therefore, the rabbis rule that it's impure. Now, this is what's important to us. Rabbi Meir, we're leaving aside right now. Now we go back to the machloket Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which you probably don't remember anymore, which is what? Amar Reish Lakish mishum Rabbi Yoshaya zoi shesofim alei tatruma. The rabbis say this is impure, this dough. And Reish Lakish goes so far as to say it's so definitively impure that we even burn the truma. Rabbi Yochanan amar, ein zo chazaka shesorfim ala truma. We do not burn this dough. Okay, this is not a case where we burn it. Why? Remember what I said. If it's only a case of doubt when it's truma that became impure, and we're not sure, according to Reish Lakish, it's definitely we ignore entirely the chance that maybe it wasn't impure, and therefore we burn it. Rabbi Yochanan says, what are you talking about? This is the case. Okay, now notice his words. This is right. This is not a case where you're going to use chazaka to allow you to burn truma, which implies, by the way, that there is some case where we will burn truma, and that's going to be the next sugya. But let's just review where we were up to. This all came because Rabbi Yochanan said in the beginning, even biyuchsim we can follow kruchim, right, chazaka, and then we said he's consistent within his approach because he says malkin ala chazakot, so klim b'sorfin ala chazakot, and that was our proof basically. And the third thing he said, which we were figuring out, which is, well, we don't burn truma based on chazaka. And this is where we just proved it. Okay, that was all to get to that last third piece, which actually wasn't really related, because the whole thing was to say that for yuchsim purposes, we rely on chazaka, a presumed status. And that we proved. Only when it comes to this truma case, we're not going to rely to actually allow it to be burned. But yes, it will make it impure out of a doubt. So now, because he said this is not a case of chazaka where you burn truma, it sounds like there is a case where he thinks you can burn truma based on chazaka, and then we'll have to figure out the differences. Where is there a case that Rabbi Yochanan would burn truma based on chazaka, presumed status? Kiddushin, as it says in the Mishna. Okay, if the first case was cute, this is one a pretty disgusting case. You have a dough in your house. And you have a lot of creepy crawling creatures in your house and frogs. Okay, so your house is pretty disgusting. And now you have all these little pieces in the dough. Okay, if that was not gross enough that your house is full of creepy crawling creatures, but now you find pieces of bodies of dead creatures in your dough. And now, okay, what would we do? We would throw out the entire dough. Okay, but this person doesn't want to throw out their dough. In those days, they didn't like to waste it all. And they want to fix it, basically. So what do? Well, they want to know, this was truma again. Is it impure or not? Now, let's get the rules. If it's one of the 8 shratzim, the shmona shratzim, that the Torah lists that whose carcasses are impure, then it will be impure. If it's a frog, the frog is not one of the shmona shratzim. So a frog is not impure. So if it's a frog, it doesn't matter. Now, you might want to take it out, but otherwise, it's not impure. And then you wouldn't need to burn it. So now, how do we figure this out? We go by the majority. We're back to majority, but we're going to see this big difference between this majority and that majority. We'll talk about in a minute. In Rov Shratzim, we look at your house. We count how many creepy crawly creatures you have and how many frogs you have. If the majority of creepy crawlers in your house are, right, if the majority of the things in your house are Shratzim, then it's Tme'ah. We assume whatever was in your Isa comes from the majority. If the majority of creatures in your house are frogs, then Tohorad, and we say it's pure. Now, what's the difference here between this case? So in this case, he says not only we go by Rov Shvatzim, and we can actually burn the dough based on the Rov. Now, what's the difference between the Rov there and the Rov here? This is why Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi sort of depend a little bit. But Rashi explains that what's the difference? This is a famous thing called Ruba De'ita Kaman and Ruba Deleta Kaman. Ruba De'ita Kaman is a rov that's in front of us. Okay, how many frogs and how many creepy crawlers is something we can count. We see it in front of us. Whether or not, right, most children pick a dough or, right, depending on which opinion you go by, or touch impure things and become impure, is a majority that's based on the human nature, right? That's very different. That's the assumptions we make about human behavior. So always go back to this thing about when I studied economics, and it's all about assumptions we make about human behavior, which are always a little bit, right? I remember we had this assignment to figure out if you could, if we lower the price of public transportation, well, more people will take public transportation, right? But everyone's got their own individual. Some people hate public transportation. Some people, right? Everybody's got different ways they behave based on all sorts of other things, right? You can't control human behavior so simply. It's not that clear cut. So there's a difference between a statistical majority, or if we call it a mathematical majority, and a human nature majority, right? What are expectations of human behavior? That's a lot weaker, really, because it's much less controlled. Whereas we can control the majority. I can count right now, assuming you can count how many creeper crawlers are in your house. But if you can count them and see there's a clear majority, that's a different story. Okay, that's one explanation. There's some other explanations which actually is affected by what you think the suffix is. Some people say it's that in the sheretz case, we know there's something in there, and therefore we can be more strict about it. Whereas in the kid case, we're not sure if the kid actually touched it, which depends who you go by, because if you go by Rashi, we know he touched it. It's just a question, did he touch other things? So anyway, there's different ways of explaining it. So now that was just a total aside, though, because how did we get here? We got here from a total aside, and then we went an aside on the aside, which is we got here because we were talking about where Rabbi Yochanan says, even b'yuchsin, we can rely on presumed status, to which we said, where do we see Rabbi Yochanan says it? And in the context of when Rabbi Yochanan said it about the skila and the sreifa and all that, and the lashes, he also mentioned this thing about that we don't burn truma based on chazaka. And then we brought the case where he says that. And then based on his language there, where he said, this is not a chazaka that you could burn truma, made it sound like there is a different chazaka where you could burn the truma, where you can assume it's definitively, even though it's not definitive, right? But based on chazaka, you could. And then that was our case right now with the frogs and the creepy crawlers. Now, Tanya Kavatei to Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to bring a braita that supports what Rabbi Yochanan said about the baby. And what is that? The first case. Now we have another rule. If you remember, we talked about that all the laws of Safek Tuma are derived from the Sota, okay? Because the Torah calls her Nitma'ah, okay? The language of impurity, even though it's something different. But we learn all laws of doubts about impurity from her. So let's talk about what we talked already, that the Sota is only going to be considered a Sota if she was alone in a closed room with a man in, a Rishtuda Yachid, a private domain. So therefore, all Safek Tumas in a private domain are going to be problematic. Whereas if they're in a public domain, if the woman was outside with this man walking in the shuk, nobody thinks that anything happened between them, and we're not going to make her a sota. So therefore, Safek Tuma in public will not be a problem. Another thing about the sota is that that a sota is yesh badat lishael. You can ask the woman. Now, she might not tell you the truth, but theoretically, there's a way to figure out if it actually really happened. Okay, because theoretically, there's a man and a woman and something happened, and they know, and they're people with knowledge, and they can speak for themselves. So it's something that theoretically somebody knows whether it happened or not. When it comes to this child, who and some other cases of Safek impurity, there might not ever be a way to know. Like, for example, the kid touched, right? We don't know. Nobody knows whether the kid, let's take Rabbi Yochanan, right? Whether the kid actually pulled the dough. Actually, there it would be a little more complicated, because there it's, did the kid pull the dough or did someone give it to him? Maybe that's the weakness really of Rabbi Yochanan, actually. But we don't know, did the kid go into the garbage and touch a creepy crawler while he was in the garbage, right? We have no idea. No one knows that. You can't ask the kid because he's too little. So that would be a case where it's called Ein Bodat Lishael. He doesn't have any way to, we don't have any way to ask, okay? And if there's no way to ask, then we're going to be more lenient, because again, it has to be like the sota, and the sota, theoretically, you can ask her. So again, whether she could tell us the truth or not, that doesn't matter. But theoretically, there's a way to find out what the truth is. So it's an interesting distinction, right? We all know that distinction, that there's some cases where you don't know something, but there's a way to figure out what the real answer is. And there's some cases where, you'll never know whether it happened or not, or whether something transpired. So Tanya Kabatei to Rabbi Yochanan. So now we're going to show a braita that holds like Rabbi Yochanan about that you don't burn the truma for the tinok. So now they say, Shnei dvarim ein behem da'at lishael, v'asa'um chachamim kema sheyesh behem da'at lishael. There's two cases where you can't ask, and yet the rabbi, now normally if you can't ask, what do we say? It's pure, it's not safek. But if we treat it like yesh bo da'at lishael, then it's going to be a case of safek, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan said. The whole case of the child was a safek case, right? Because that's why you don't burn it, but yet it is problematic, right? We do view it as truma that became disqualified, but you can't burn it because it's safek. So now, what are these two cases that the rabbis made it as if you could ask, meaning the law is safek tuma is a problem. Tinok, our case of the child. Ve'od acheret. So tinok hadam aram, that's the case we already saw. Ve'od acheret mahi, what's the second case? Isa b'toch habayit. Okay, this is going to be our last crazy case for today. There's a dough in the house, v'tarnagolim umashkim tmeim sham. And now we have roosters, and we have impure drinks right nearby. So the question is, right now what we see, nimtzeu nikurim ba'isa, moving now to Amabed, we see pecks of the rooster in the dough. So we know that the rooster pecked in the dough. The question is, did the rooster first drink some of the impure liquids, then peck the dough, which would mean there's now impure liquids in the dough, and it caused the dough to be impure. If you remember, mashkim have the status to be able to, they go up one level to become usually food can't be matame other food, but drinks they were strict about, and drinks can be matame food. Tolin, so what do we say? We say we leave it. No. This is obviously a case of ein bo dat l'sha'el. You can't ask the rooster to drink the liquid, and yet, so normally you'd say, okay, since there's ein bo dat l'sha'el, we rule leniently, and it's nothing. But what does he say here? Because this is one of the two exceptions. Tolin. That means we leave it hanging, meaning lo chlim v'lo sorfim. We don't eat it, but we also don't burn it. That's your classic safek. To which we're going to go out in asada this case again, and then with that we'll finish and start a new Mishnah. This is only with white liquids, okay, like a white wine, let's say. You have red wine, we'd obviously see red in the dough, and this wouldn't be an issue. Well, we could have ended here, but the Gemara says, what do you mean? Even if it was red, maybe it got absorbed in the dough, and if you had a little bit of red, it could have gotten mixed up and gone. You wouldn't see it anymore. So Rabbi Yochanan, and this is a little hard to understand what he means here, but we'll just kind of explain as best as we can. Shama beribi, this thing Shama beribi, beribi is Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi said white but not red, he heard this from somebody, upirusho lo shama, but he didn't really hear it fully well. He didn't understand it fully because it's not really what he said. It should be like this. Again, there's a bunch of different interpretations of how to read this line because it's difficult to read, which means the commentaries all have different interpretations. I'm going with the one that made the most sense to me. Lo shanu ela v'mashkim tzlulim shebevuah shel tinok nikarba. Only clear liquids. Okay, with clear liquids, we can assume that even, and it's interesting, I don't know why they use this language, that you could see the reflection of a young child in the liquids. I don't know why specifically a young child is mentioned here, but whatever reason. So it's so clear that you could see a reflection in it, that will get absorbed and you won't notice it. And that's why you have to be concerned. But if it's clouded, then you will notice it for sure. So what they claim, again, it's hard to really understand, but it sounds like red clear could theoretically get absorbed. But if it's red muddled waters, liquid, then there's no way it would get absorbed without noticing. And therefore, if it was a red muddled liquid, question is, does it have to also be red, or any muddled liquid will be noticed in the dough? And therefore you wouldn't basically have to worry if you don't see anything. In other words, if the liquid next to you is this cloudy red substance, or maybe cloudy any substance, and you don't see any of that cloudy substance in the dough, then we can just assume that that the rooster didn't touch it. Okay, but anything other than that, any clear liquid will be a problem. You have to worry that maybe we just don't see it inside. Okay, so you can try an experiment at home and take a batch of dough and add some cloudy red liquid and see if there's a difference between the clear and the cloudy. That's what Rabbi Yochanan seems to say. Okay, can't promise that it actually is the case. And it could be that Rabbi Yochanan means something else. In other words, it's a little complicated to understand exactly what he means and how he relates to what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. Okay, now we get to laws of yichud. We're ending the Masechah in a bit of a strange place, which is, and maybe it's because we're talking about relationships and marriage, and now we're talking about yichud and all sorts of, it's not just yichud we're going to get to. Yichud is seclusion. A woman shouldn't be secluded with a man alone. How many women, how many men, we're going to get to this because there's concern something might happen. We're going to get later to what occupations should you avoid. Okay, this is a good reminder because that's going to be the last daf, reminder that we're doing that on Sunday at the Siyum. If you haven't registered, you can register. It's going to be an interesting way to end our Masechet about all sorts of occupations you should avoid because they might lead to unpleasant sexual encounters, okay? So we'll get to that when we get to the Siyum. So now we're starting with yichud. You shouldn't, one man should not go to a secluded place certainly with one woman, but even with two women. We'll get to in the Gemara why this is. But one woman with two men is okay. Okay, basically meaning that one man with two women, we're worried that they might have sexual relations, but two men with one woman, there's no chance that, and again, we shouldn't say no chance, and the Gemara at the end of it, we'll get back to this, but it's less likely that something will happen. Rabbi Shimon omer, af ish echad mityacher im shtei nashim bizman she'ishto imo. So Rabbi Shimon says, one man with two women works if the woman is with him. Okay? His wife is with him. If his wife is there, it's not a problem. V'yasheni mahem b'puntaki, right? Let's say they're in an inn together, mipnei she'ishto v'shamarto, because his wife will make sure that nothing happens. So two women, yes, but not if it's his wife. Mityacher adam im imo v'im bito. This is an interesting thing. I don't know if you ever thought about, but it's forbidden for a man to sleep with his daughter, and it's forbidden for a woman to sleep with her son. But they can actually be alone in a house together. We're not worried, even though it's an isur arayot, right? One of those forbidden relationships, that something will happen. And not only that, but yasheni mahem b'kiruv basar. You can even sleep together without clothing on. Okay, it sounds a little odd, but you can even sleep together. But once they get older, once they're a little older, it doesn't say what age, but then already you can't sleep without clothing on. You'd have to have clothing. Okay, hard to imagine you would sleep anyway without clothing on, but that's what they're describing. Okay, so now the Gemara goes into, let's understand. It's my time. What's the reason, and be prepared, you're not going to like this. What's the reason why one man can't be alone with two women, but one woman can be with two men? So Tana de Be'eliyahu, ho'il v'nashim da'atan kalot alehem. Now you might remember this phrase from why shouldn't women learn Torah? Because they're not right intellectually minded, maybe is a way you could say it. What does this have to do with yichud? Okay, very good question. So there's a bunch of different interpretations. I'll give you them, even though none of them are fully satisfactory, I would say. But one is that Rashi says they're more easily seduced. Okay, because they're da'atan kalot, they're light, they're frivolous behavior. They're more likely seduced, and therefore one man with two women, he might easily seduce them. Whereas two men with one woman, it's less likely that she'll be able to seduce them. I don't know, right? It's hard to understand. Number two, it could be, and this comes up later, that they will more likely cover up for each other. Okay, why da'atan kalot means that, but they're very likely going to cover up for each other, and therefore it's more likely something will happen because they know that no one will tell. Whereas two men, they're less likely to cover up for each other. Okay, I know someone wrote, Debbie, you wrote in the chat about gang rape, and we're going to get back to this, okay, where the Gemara is going to say, well, in that case, we do think they're going to cover up for each other, and therefore we are concerned. So if you're already going there, which I'm sure your mind is going there, don't worry. They talk about that as well. And we're going to see really by the end of the daf, this is not so black and white, okay? That's what the next two sections are really trying to say. This isn't as black and white as it seems, because there's obvious exceptions to all these cases. And it somewhat depends on the scenario and the situation and who the people are and what the concerns are. The third explanation is that because da'atan kalot, and this would match better the lack of intellectual capability, they might not understand the severity of sleeping with this guy. Now, hard to understand, they wouldn't understand the severity of it. That's something even without intellectual capabilities, I think we all kind of know. But perhaps, that's another explanation. And therefore, we're more concerned that something will happen because they don't really care so much. They don't understand so much the severity, and therefore will be more likely to transgress. Okay, so that's what he explains. Now we want to know Menani Milei. Now, what are we looking for here? We're looking for the fact that yichud is in general prohibited between, again, it's a little unclear what the question is, but let's go with it's prohibited for other arayot, just not for a mother and son. Just not for a mother and son or a father and daughter. Okay, that's the only arayot. That's what the Mishna mentioned. Only those, but not any others. So any other forbidden relationship, you're actually forbidden to be alone together. So where did they get this from? This is a very strange proof. Even the Gemara is going to think it's strange. You'll see the Gemara's reaction, but it's still a proof, okay? It's some sort of reference in the Torah. In fact, they call it Mishum Rabbi Yishmael. You'll see Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yishmael remez liyichud min Torah minayin. Okay, it's saying where's an allusion to this in the Torah? Not that this is a real proof from the Torah, but where can you see a hint to this issue of? And again, it could be maybe it's saying all yichud is a problem, and only in this one case it's not. So what do we have here? Shene'emar ki yisitcha achicha ben imecha. This is what we call a mesit. This is when someone convinces someone else to go worship idols. Now, the Torah basically says if someone seduces you to, convinces you to go worship idols, and basically, don't listen to them. But what's weird about it is it doesn't say ki yisitcha, right? The Torah often uses the word of chave, right? Re'echa, your friend. Here it says your brother, the son of your mother, which is strange on two counts. Why is it talking about a brother? And why specifically the son of your mother, not the son of your father? So the drasha is going to go like this, again, it's not really a drasha, it's an illusion. It somehow alludes to yichud. How so? The chi ben en mesit to ben avi no mesit. In other words, what? Only your brother through your mother is going to try to seduce you to go worship idols, but not your brother through your father. What do they say? The Torah is choosing this example because it's the most likely example. Why is it the most likely example? Because two sons are allowed to be in their mother's house alone. In other words, each son can be alone with his mother. It's not a problem. But what do you learn from here? And that's the reason why they're friends and one's going to try to push the other is because they live together. Why do they live together? They live together with their mother because they're sons through the mother. Well, if they live with the mother, assuming the mother's not married, right? She doesn't have a husband, or she doesn't have the father anymore because that's why they're the son of the mother. So why is it not a yichud problem? Here you learn it's not a yichud problem because they can live together with the mother. And it is seemingly a problem anywhere else. Okay. Again, it's a very hard proof to follow. Like how this doesn't really prove it. Like I said, it's only an illusion, but they get from here that this alludes to the fact that all other yichud is forbidden of arayot, but of forbidden relationships, but this one is permitted. So now, just in case you weren't convinced that this isn't so clear, well, Pashche described Mike Teep. So the Gemara says, what's the real simple reading here? Okay, let's go with what's the basic. Like, what's the real reason why it says the son of your mother and not the son of your father? Because this wasn't so convincing. Yes, you could say there's a reference to this halacha, but okay. So Amar Abai. Abai says, Lo mebayakam. It's not that it's most likely this will happen with the mother, with this brother through the mother, and not the brother through the father. It's actually the opposite. Lo mebaya ben av. More likely that your brother through your father is going to try to seduce you to do something bad. Why? Because he hates you. Why does he hate you? Because you're both fighting over the inheritance of the father. You're both supposed to inherit the father. And if he could get rid of you, get you to die young or something, get killed by the court, he'll end up with more inheritance. So he has an ulterior motive to go against you. So, of course, now what does the Torah say? If your brother is trying to seduce you, don't listen to him. Well, of course, you're not going to listen if your brother from your father's side is trying to seduce you to do the sin, because you know that he's just trying to mess you up because he doesn't like you. El afilu ben ein, but even the son, that's what it's telling you, even the son of a mother, okay, that you share the same mother, a brother through the mother, de lo sanele, that they don't both inherit from the mother. So there's no issues here. There's no inward fighting here. You might think you could listen to him. Kamash malan comes to tell you, don't even listen. If he doesn't have any ulterior motive here, and he's just trying to get you to join him, well, don't listen to him either. And that's the chidush of the pasuk, and that's why it says beni mecha. Okay, obviously all brothers who share the same father don't hate each other, right? This is obviously talking about right? Most people don't also try to seduce you to worship idols. So this obviously is a bad brother, right? Someone who's gone off the path, and therefore, you could think that maybe he's trying to pull you down somehow also. Okay, so anyway, whether that's the simple reading also is a bit of a question. It's not the way I would have thought the pasuk reads, but again, it does answer this question. Why does it specifically say your brother through your father, your mother? Okay, now back to yichud. Nema manitin deloka Abba Shaul. Okay, is it possible our Mishna doesn't hold like Abba Shaul? Why? Tanya. Okay, now we're going to talk about a bit of an unpleasant topic. We have an infant death. Okay, and now we're taking the baby out to be buried. Now, normally at a ceremony, you would have either a coffin or something. You would take the baby out. You would take the person who dies out on a bed or out in a coffin. And a lot of people would come. But in infant burial, it's usually very small, and you don't even use a coffin. Okay, what this is going to describe is kol 30 yom. If it's within 30 days, you just carry him in your bosom. V'nikbar b'isha achat u'shnei anashim. And you can go out and bury the baby with a few people. And how do they describe a few people? 1 woman and 2 men. But you can't go 1 man and 2 women. Why? Because the cemetery was outside of the city, and it was a secluded place. There weren't a lot of people there, and there's a concern that something might transpire. So that seems to match the laws in our Mishna perfectly. Abba Shaul omer af b'isha achad u'shtei nashim. Abba Shaul says, I don't have a problem with 1 man and 2 women either. 1 woman and 1 man would be a problem, but 1 man and 2 women, no problem. So is it possible he disagrees with our Mishnah? To which the Gemara says, well, we can explain it. And you might have been thinking this yourself, and this is why I told you that by the end of the daf, we're going to see it's not so black and white. It depends on the situation, and it depends on the nature of the people, which we're going to get to both, right? That will lead us to gang rape, the second part. But this is the situation. Afilu tema Abba Shaul b'shat aninu taver yitzred. Most people do not have this strong yetzer when they're unfortunately mourning their infant's death, that they're going to now end up in a sexual encounter with a woman outside in the cemetery, right? That is not something that is on their mind at that point, which means that while there are normal laws of yichud, there are certain situations where we just say, it doesn't really matter, right? You don't have to worry. At least one man, one woman would still be a problem, but one man and two women, we're really not worried anything's going to transpire because we assume that there's not much of an evil inclination there within the person. Rabbanan, now why are they worried about this? Well, Rabbi Yitzchak. I'm Rabbi Yitzchak. We're going to take this pasuk that's a very unclear pasuk from Eicha. Ma yitonen adam chai. What will a live person complain about? Gever al chatav. Okay, a man about his sins. Not really clear what this means. Afilu. So how does Rabbi Yitzchak translate this? Yitonen from the lashon of onen. Onen is when you're mourning for someone. Bishat aninuto shel adam. Okay, which is ma yitonen adam chai. When a person is alive and is an onen, mourning over somebody, gever al chataav, they understand gavar yitzro mitgaber alav, as his sins will overcome him, meaning he'll still have an evil inclination to sin. The Abba Shaul says, what are you talking about? That's not what the pasuk means. Now, this is something I think can relate to in the last number of weeks, which is when tragedy befalls you, often what's yitonen? Yitonen from the lashon of to complain, the mitonenim. What are you complaining? A man is complaining about God and saying, what have you done to me, God? Like, how could you have done this to me? V'hachi kamar, what it means to say is this. Ma yitra'em al midotav. Why are you complaining about God? Now, notice, ma yitonem. Why are you complaining? Adam chai, you are alive. V'chi gever al chata'av, or v'chi gavar al chata'av. What? Have you overcome your sins? Dayo chayim shenatati lo. What are you complaining about? Yes, you're dealing with some terrible tragedy, but you've sinned also, and you're still alive. So be happy. What it's really saying in a bit of a harsh way, but be happy with what you have. And you still have your life, you still have other things, and that's what that pasuk means. It has nothing to do with whether you're going to have an evil inclination, and want to have relations with this woman while you're mourning your child. And then Rabbanan, why do they not agree? So in the end, what pushes the rabbis? Because the Gemara really seems to think you're right. Nothing's really going to happen. Well, Rabbanan, what motivated them? And here there's at least three different interpretations. I'm going to just go with one of them in Rashi. You can see Rashi has two altogether, and then there's other ones. But Rabbanan, well, the rabbis were motivated because it was actually a case that happened. And what's the case? That's a good question. The Gemara doesn't tell you, but Rashi claims that the case was there was a family or a couple, I don't know, whatever. It was a few people. They pretended they were taking out a baby to bury. They took out a live baby, pretended it was a dead baby. Horrible to think about. Again, that's why maybe the story isn't really the story, but pretended, went out of the city to the cemetery and committed sin there. And that's why the rabbi said we don't allow this, because people might come to pretend and use this as a pretense to go and commit terrible sins. So again, a little hard to understand. Some people say the case was something else entirely. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. Okay, last part for today. Avali sha'achat. Okay, but one woman, right, with two men is okay. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav lo shanu ela b'ksherim. Well, this is only if the two men are good people. But biprutzim afilu be'asara nami lo. And here we get to the gang rape. If there are 10 evil people, then we're concerned that they're going to do something to this woman, and this, they will not tell anybody, and they'll do terrible things, and this could be a problem. There was a case where these 10 guys carried her out on a bed or on a stretcher, and they pretended, again, this is maybe why they thought this other story was that, they pretended she was dead, and then they ended up raping her outside the city, and terrible story. And therefore, they said, well, again, this is all in proportion, right? Number one was maybe we can be lenient when there's no concern at all that anything's going to happen because of the frame of mind that people are in. This is, well, the numbers really aren't relevant when we're talking about something terrible that could possibly happen. And Amar Rabbi Yosef Teidad Demichabre Be'asara V'Gam Be'Kishur V'Lo Machasve Me'adad. There are 10 people who got together and stole a beam and weren't embarrassed in front of each other. Now this group, right? Group theft. We all know this goes on, right? And no one's embarrassed from each other. This, by the way, goes back to the fact that maybe with the women, it's that they're not embarrassed to, they're not embarrassed by both of them having relations with this guy. And just like these 10 people aren't embarrassed all having relations with this one woman. And therefore, in that kind of scenario, it would obviously be forbidden. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll get back to this last point about the sota in tomorrow's stuff. Wishing everybody a good day. let's hope for better news today.